Yesterday I got delayed, so today he got delayed even more. There's one thing that I should have said yesterday that I didn't, and that is what is the total cost of reasonable climate policy. And I emphasize that you actually can't answer that question without adding a whole lot of specific detail. But if we sort of pick a reasonable target and we implement a smart climate policy, and that's what I'm going to talk about today, the costs are negligible. Essentially, you can fully decarbonize the economy by the end of this century at a cost that is measures in tens of a percent of GDP, which may seem like a lot of money if you express it in dollars, because the economy is fairly big, the world economy is fairly big. But if you think about it, really what that means is that if we had no climate policy, then we would reach a certain level of income on the 1st of January 2100, and with a reasonable climate policy we would reach the same income on the 1st of July of 2100. That's sort of the order of magnitude that you need to think about if it comes to climate policy. That's sort of what it's going to cost. Which doesn't seem to be that great of a concern, right? And the reason for that is actually fairly straightforward. I mean, yesterday I talked a little bit about the technical options that we have for greenhouse gas emission reduction. At the moment you can make electricity from gas and coal with something like 4 or 6 cents per kilowatt hour. Wind and solar is perhaps 8 or 10 cents per kilowatt hour now, but the projections are that it's going to come down fairly rapidly. But even if we were to add 25% to the cost of making electricity, that cannot be that economically disruptive, right? Because if you look at sort of the economy, the world economy at a cost basis, then fuels, energy that we put in, is about 2% of the total cost. So if that 2% goes up to perhaps 2.5%, it cannot cost the economy, right? If you do it gradually, you take your time, you set reasonable targets, and you have a smart climate policy. So the solution to climate change can be very cheap, right? That does not mean that it will be very cheap, and that's what I'm going to talk about today. But first I need to finish yesterday, right? So despite this evidence that climate policy is not going to cost the world, there are also claims that it's going to be even cheaper. There are people out there who claim that they could reduce emissions and save money at the same time. Now, most of these claims are bogus. They come from politicians or activists or engineers. And one of the confusions that is out there has to do with this particular graph that it did show, that what we have seen is that market forces drive energy efficiency up or energy intensity down, and have so since we have records. But there are engineers out there are politicians out there who claim that this would not happen were it not for their genius, right? And if you sort of like set this trend towards ever greater energy efficiency to zero, and you assume that anything that happens in the market is because of you, then of course you can make the claim that you can make money and reduce emissions at the same time. So that is where a lot of that comes from. Bush the younger at one point announced that his great contribution to climate policy would be that he would improve energy efficiency by 14% in the decade after the announcement, forgetting that in the decades prior to the announcement the trend was 18% per decade, right? So he actually proposed to slow down the market. Another thing that engineers often get confused about is hidden costs. A lot of sort of new inventions look very good on paper, and if you do the simple cost-benefit analysis, yes, then it does make sense to put in a smarter heating system that saves on energy. Yes, it's more expensive to buy, but you save money later. And then they use the wrong discount rate. They assume that households can borrow at the same rate of interest as governments can. Now, most of you are students, most of you are in debt. Try to go to the bank and say, I want to borrow money at 0.5% because that's what the government does. No, that doesn't work, right? So that is one thing that they get wrong. Another thing that often goes wrong is that there's additional costs that are hard to quantify. And if you put in a box standard heating system in your house, that means that your local repair person can fix it. Whereas if you put in the latest model and the most advanced model, yes, it's more expensive and yes, you will save on your energy bill, but if it breaks down, as it invariably does 2 days before Christmas, you need to fly in an engineer from Germany or Sweden to fix it, right? Your local repair person would look at it and say, I've never seen this model, I don't know what to do with it, right? And if you start ignoring that sort of cost, then of course things look cheap. Go ahead.
What discount rates do you use for the models? For if you look into 50 years, markets are happy if they know what the discount rate will be in the next 5 years.
I'm going to talk about discounting in week 3. I mean, if we're talking about households making decisions, then it should be the discount rate that the household uses, right? And if you can borrow at a stretch at 6% because you are a credit risk, because you're a student, not because of your personality or anything, right? Then that is the appropriate discount rate for you. And that's how you should evaluate investment decisions.
I think predicted to be the same 2050.
No.
That's what do you use then for 2000 for models and predicting up to 2050?
As I said, we'll come back to that in week 3. But you're making the decision whether or not to replace your heating system today, right? So the discount rate in 2050 is utterly irrelevant for that question, because the lifetime of a heating system is 10-15 years. And you can't resell it or anything. So whatever the future discount rate may be is utterly irrelevant for decisions today. Right? Okay, so there is confusion out there, but there's also about that it may be possible to save money and reduce emissions at the same time. But there's also genuine claims that perhaps this is feasible. And the starting point of that realization is to note that the economic models that I very briefly touched upon yesterday that are used to assess the cost of climate policy are typically optimization or equilibrium models. And the starting point of these models is the assumption that the economy is perfect and in equilibrium and therefore in a Pareto optimum. And if that is your starting point, then whatever you do, you incur costs, right? If you're at the top of the hill, then the only way is down. It's as simple as that. But if your starting point is that the market is somehow distorted or imperfect, there's not enough knowledge, or there's market power, or something like that, or people are not fully rational, then you're not necessarily at the top of the hill. You can be anywhere on the hill. And then it may be that if you move to the east, you're going up, and if you move to the west, you're going down, right? And that is the basic insight here, right? If you start in a suboptimal situation, then it may be that climate policy yes, it costs more money because you make energy more expensive, but if you then at the same time reduce the distortions in the economy, or you reduce market power, or you increase information, then you actually move closer to the optimum, and that is a positive, and that would at least offset the, or at least partially offset the costs of climate policy per se. Now, people have looked into this through the recycling of carbon taxes. So the basic assumption here is that climate policy is done through a carbon tax. And the good thing about a carbon tax is that the government then has revenue. And the question is, what can the government do with that revenue, and can that actually help the economy? Now, if you look at public policy, or public economics, you talk to these people, they will tell you two things, or three things. That a tax is more distortionary, and a tax is distortionary if it moves people away from the Pareto optimum. If you get people to do things that they would not have done without that tax, right? And a tax is more distortionary if the tax base is narrower. That makes a lot of sense, right? For every €1,000,000 raised, if you raise it from fewer people, the tax base is narrower, then you're going to push those fewer people harder, right? For the same amount of revenue. So the narrower the tax base, the greater the tax pushes people, the economy away from its optimal state. And the second is also intuitive. If the price elasticity is higher, if people respond stronger to price signals, then you're going to push them further away from the untaxed Pareto equilibrium, Pareto optimum, and you have a more distortionary tax. Now, there's also a rule of thumb in public economics, and that is that the deadweight loss of a tax is roughly quadratic in the level of the tax. Right? Now, if you start putting these things together, and we look at a carbon tax, then starting with the last point, we start from a low base, right? So the deadweight loss is small because the carbon tax is small, right? Price elasticities are low because you're not, if the price of oil goes up a little bit, you're not going to buy a new car or move house, right, immediately. So the initial response is fairly low, so the price elasticity is low. And the tax base is fairly wide. The tax base is everybody who uses energy, right? So a carbon tax is not particularly distortionary. Now, if you use the carbon tax revenue to lower, say, labor taxes, what can we say from first principles? Well, labor taxes are already high, right? So the deadweight loss is high. Price elasticity is pretty low. People don't change job or stop working if the labor tax goes up or down a little bit, right? So that is roughly the same as with the carbon tax. But the tax base is only those who work. And with sort of thresholds about how much you need to earn, the tax base is actually relatively narrow. So sort of based on first principles, if you can shift the tax burden from labor to energy or carbon, you're going to reduce the distortionality of the fiscal system. And that means you have a welfare gain and probably more rapid economic growth, right? So if that is what you can do, then you at least partially offset the implications of the carbon tax. There is a second effect going on, and that is, of course, if you make one of the inputs into the economy more expensive, then you drive up inflation, you drive down the real value of money, and that means that your labor taxes start biting harder. But that interaction is there. I don't think it's particularly large, but it's there in theory. How real is this? Well, people stuck it in models of the European economy. Here you see some of the results. Welfare variation is on the vertical axis, and positive is good and negative is bad. And you see that a lot of things are positive. On the horizontal axis, we're looking essentially at the intensity of climate policy, running from no climate policy on the left to a 30% emission reduction all the way to the right. And you see that, yeah, in Europe this seems to be fairly positive, and it doesn't really depend on whether you look at the welfare variation, it's an equivalent variation, or consumption or GDP. It all seems to be fairly positive. Not uniformly, right? You see some negatives in some countries, but it's by and large positive. And that is largely independent of how you formulate the labor market. That is what you see here. And it's largely, it does depend on how you recycle your money, but that is, I think, better seen in this particular table. This table is old, as you can see. This is a prediction about what would happen in the year 2010 if there were a $40 carbon tax in the USA. And there's 4 alternative representations of the US economy. That's in the different columns. Those are different names of different models that have been looked at this, and the question is simple. You impose a $40 tax, and then you use the money for stuff. And then what are the implications for the size of the US economy? And on the first row, the government just returns the carbon tax as a check in the post to every US citizen. And that has a uniformly negative effect. And you may think that is weird, right? The government has never done that to me. The US government does this sort of thing, that they just send people a check in the post and say, this is your tax money back. People pay different rates of tax, right? So if you send everybody a check of $300, you have distributional implications, right? But it's also not the smartest way of spending the money. Of course, it's a terribly popular way of spending the money. You can use the money to increase government spending. You still see a negative effect. You can reduce personal income taxes or corporate income taxes. And if you use personal income taxes, it's uniformly negative. With corporate income taxes, that's essentially profits. Some models say it's positive. Some models say it's negative. But then if you move to the very bottom row, and there's payroll taxes, same story. Some models say it's positive, some models say it's negative. If you move to the bottom row, then you see that if you use the money to increase investment credits, that are essentially tax breaks for investment, you see a uniformly positive effect on the US economy. Now, what do we learn from this? 2 things. First, the US tax structure is very different from the European tax structure. In Europe, the tax burden is primarily on households, and in the US, the tax burden is primarily on companies. So that immediately implies that you want to do different things with your tax revenue, right? In Europe, you want to reduce labor taxes because they are extraordinarily high. In the US, you want to decrease profit taxes and investment taxes because they are extraordinarily high. Second thing that you notice is the different models disagree. So depending on how you think the economy works, this effect may be positive or negative, right? And that leads me to the final point that is not on the slide. It is on the slide. Oh no, it's not on the slide. That is, if you want this to work, you need if you want these real savings to work, you need 2 things. First, you need politicians who understand how the economy works and know how to tell a good economic model from a bad economic model. That is rare, right? And second, you need politicians who resist the temptation of using the tax revenue, the carbon tax revenue, to reward their political allies, right? So yes, these carbon tax recycling effects exist. They exist in theory. I am not convinced that they also exist in reality, right? So be very careful with those arguments. Okay, now what was I planning to do today? This is actually a good introduction to the notion that climate policy design matters, and it matters a lot. And that's what I'm going to talk about now. Okay, this is where we are. This is where we should have been half an hour ago. How is the government going to do it? There is some sort of target for climate policy. We're going to talk about it in week 3, whether those targets may be coming from. And now the question is, so what are you going to do, regulator? And there's various options. And some of this material you may have seen before, so I can go through it relatively quickly. The most common form of regulation, not just in environment, but just the most common form of the regulation, is so-called direct regulation or command and control. And essentially it is that the government tells you what you can and cannot do, and the government tells you how to do it if you can, right? The reason that this is so popular is, I think, twofold. In environmental regulation, it's popular because there's a lot of natural scientists involved, and this is sort of how they think. In every sort of regulation, there is always lawyers involved, and this is how they think. Just write down a regulation, this is how you do it, right? As simple as that. But in environmental regulation, there's a third element. And that is that if you look at the environment in Europe and North America in the 1960s and the 70s, it was foul, right? Air was toxic, rivers caught fire, the environment was pretty dirty at that time. And then from the early 70s on, we've seen a lot of regulation, and now our environment is pretty clean. And that is because of direct regulation. Essentially, the government stepped in and forbade all sorts of things. And the people who cut their teeth in the 70s and 80s in environmental regulation were young civil servants then. They're senior civil servants now. And they look back to the start of their career and they say, well, direct regulation worked then, and it greatly helped my career. Why would I change course, right? Even though environmental problems have completely changed in nature since the 70s. So what is direct regulation, and why don't we think it works that well? Well, there's different forms. You can regulate the inputs that you use. If you want to buy a car in the European market, it has to meet certain fuel efficiency standards. It has to get a certain number of kilometers per liter of fuel that you put in, and if it does not meet that requirement, then you're simply not allowed to sell that car, and as a result you cannot buy such a car. So that is an input regulation. There's also regulations on the technology that is used, and again, going back to automotive stuff, you cannot buy a car that doesn't have a catalytic converter. That is to take out some of the conventional air pollutants, and as a byproduct we also take out lead, because the lead messes up the catalytic converters. That was introduced out of concern for urban air quality mostly. And this immediately highlights one of the problems with direct regulation. You can sort of like think, well, this is a smart thing to do, right? Those NOx and other things that come out of cars are pretty bad for the environment, or pretty bad for your health, or bad for monuments, and so on and so forth. Let's take them out by putting a gadget in the car. And that's a simple solution. The regulator knows how this works. They have a reasonable understanding how engines are put together. And you put in this additional thing and it solves the problem. But it does not necessarily lead to a cheap solution, right? Because the catalytic converter costs the same per car. It's about 300 euros nowadays. But if you drive your car for 150,000 kilometers a year, then a catalytic converter is dirt cheap, right? And that 300 euro investment saves a whole lot of emissions. But if you use your car only to drive to the church once a week, then it's a very expensive thing to put in your car, and you hardly save any emissions, right? So that is the basic problem with direct regulation. It is always a one-size-fits-all solution. Almost always a one-size-fits-all solution. And even if, in this case, we have homogeneous technology, there's diesel engines and there's petrol engines, and that's it, right? And all diesel engines are basically the same, and all petrol engines are basically the same. So you have homogeneous technology, you have very heterogeneous use of that technology, and that makes that the costs differ greatly by user, right? You can also regulate the output. That can be just the product characteristics. In Europe, you cannot sell toys that are meant for children under 3 if the paint on those toys contains carcinogenic material. Very sensible regulation, because children eat anything, right? And cancer is bad, so that makes perfect sense. Or you can put regulations on the waste produced. For instance, you can put restrictions on sulfur emissions. You can also restrict the timing at which activities take place. At Schiphol, you cannot take off before 6 in the morning, and you cannot land after 11. Or actually, if you land after 11, you incur a large fine. You can regulate the location of activities. There's a whole lot of things you cannot do in nature reserves, for instance, or you can just outright forbid something. And if you look at chlorofluorocarbons, CFCs, you cannot make them, you cannot sell them, and you cannot buy them, you cannot use them, right? Just to make sure all 4 things are forbidden by law. So that is direct regulation. Great successes in the past, works perfectly fine if the regulator knows what they're doing, and it works perfectly fine if there is homogeneous technology and homogeneous use of that technology. But if not, you run into issues. So if you want to clean up, say, tanneries that used to put a lot of heavy chemicals or dirty chemicals in the river, they all use the same stuff, and you just go in and you talk to them and you figure out how do they use this, what do they use, what could they use instead, and then you write down a smart regulation that affects all tanneries because they do all the same things. But if you want to regulate, say, energy use, which is very, very different across different economic agents, it is hard to get it right, because by law and by convenience you have to come up with a one-size-fits-all solution. Most economists would nowadays favor, or actually have always favored, to use so-called market-based instruments or incentive-compatible instruments. And 2 of them are listed here. You can impose a tax, that is, you pay a charge or a levy or a penalty for every unit consumed, produced or emitted. The word that you use for an environmental tax depends on the legal tradition of the country you're talking about and the political sensitivities that you're talking about, but it's basically all the same. Subsidy works the opposite way. Twice, you pay the polluter to not do something. So with a tax, you get the polluter to pay for doing something. With a subsidy, you pay the polluter to not do something. And they have the same effect in the short run, which I'll show in a minute, but an opposite effect in the long run. So the reason that taxes and subsidies are different in the long run is as follows. If you tax a polluting activity, you increase the average cost of that activity. And that means that you reduce the return on investment in that activity. And that means that in the long run you shrink that sector relative to what it otherwise would have been. Subsidies work the opposite way. You reduce the costs of the polluting activity, that is, you increase the returns on investment, and that means that you grow the sector relative to what it would have been, right? And of course there's greatly different distributional effects between taxes and subsidies, right? With taxes, money flows from the polluter to the government. With subsidies, money flows from the government or the taxpayer to the polluters, right? The third market instrument that you can use are tradable permits, which essentially work as follows. The government sets an overall target on consumption, production, or emissions. Say we are allowed to emit 100 million tons of CO2. Then that 100 million tons is sort of split into 1 million 1-ton parts, and then every producer, every polluter is assigned a certain amount, and this is how much they can emit. And so far, so direct regulation, right? This is just an output restriction. But this is where the market bit kicks in. If a producer thinks she has too many of these permits, she can sell them to another polluter who thinks he has too few, right? And if you're in a company where emission reduction is cheap and you got a generous allocation, then you actually have another opportunity to make a profit, right? If it's cheaper to reduce emissions in-house than the price these permits would fetch, you could sell them. And vice versa, if you're in a company where it's very expensive to reduce emissions, you don't have to. Instead, you can buy additional permits on the market, right? And I'll get back to the equivalence in a second, I think. I don't know exactly how many seconds that will be. The permit market works fine once those permits are allocated. But the question is, of course, how do you start this thing? I sort of said there's this 100 million ton cap with overall, and then we allocate it to different polluters. But how, right? There are essentially 4 ways of doing it, and of course every possible mixture of these 4 can be conceived of. The typical way of doing this is through so-called grandparenting, where essentially the government creates these permits and then gives them away for free based on proportional to emissions in the recent past. Why is this called grandparenting? Because this is what grandparents do. They give away goodies and they do so based on the past rather than the future, right? That's why it's called grandparenting. The good thing about grandparenting is that it's politically easy, because essentially you confirm the status quo. You introduce this tradable permits. You essentially say emissions used to be free, but now you have to pay for them. And then, of course, you immediately have a corporate lobby against you. But if you then say, well, we're going to give you those permits for free, then they're much more ready to agree to this, right? So that it's just politically easy. It, of course, punishes those companies that just before this regulation was introduced did their best to reduce emissions, right? Because they're going to get a low allocation, whereas companies that polluted heavily in the past are essentially rewarded for bad behavior, right? So it's politically not necessarily fair. Another problem in grandparenting is that you start the market by giving away everything for free. So people don't know what these things are worth. So it takes time to discover the market. And essentially, nobody knows what to do in the beginning. So another way of doing this that would sort of solve this initial price problem is to sell these permits to the highest bidder in one form of auction or another. Good thing is that it starts with a price signal. Everybody knows what these things are worth. Good thing from the revenue perspective is that there's a lot of money coming into the government. The bad thing from the polluter's perspective is that a lot of money flows out from their accounts, right? So this is politically more difficult. Nowadays, most schemes sort of use a mixture of grandparenting and auctioning. You think back on Pigou, this is a strange thing to do, right? Because essentially what the Pigou tax and Pigou's initial ideas were about was that there's an externality and you're going to pay for that externality and then it will be internalized on the polluter side. But the payment should go to the pollutee, to the victim of the pollution. That is what Pigou proposed. But if you're auctioning these permits, then essentially the revenue goes to the government. And if you're grandparenting the permits, then de facto the revenue goes to the polluters, not to the victims. So academics have suggested that really the permits should be given to those who suffer most from the pollution. Now, that may seem like a fair solution, right? It's complicated because you need to identify who is the victim of the pollution, and we'll talk about it next week. What do we know about the impacts of climate change? That is, who are the victims? We know, we have a rough idea already, right? It's people in Bangladesh, whose whole country, or 25% of whose country is going to be flooded. So they should get the money, they should get a permit, right? And then if we want to emit CO2, we need to buy the permit from the Bangladeshis, and that is fair, right? Because they suffer the consequences. It's also completely a political non-starter, right? This is not going to happen. Because a lot of money would change that. What people are now talking about, and it almost made it through the Californian Congress, is to give out these permits on a per capita basis. That is, everybody just gets a share, and if somebody wants to emit CO2, they have to buy it from the households that got the initial permits. There's a basis for this in international law, which says that the atmosphere is the common property of humankind, and putting CO2 in the atmosphere spoils that property, and that is ours, right? So this is the fair thing to do, and it's the legal thing to do. It may seem fair, but it is not necessarily, right? Because if you give people an equal share or an equal amount of permits, and you compare and contrast, say, people in Norway to people in Spain. I mean, in Norway you need a lot of energy because of large distances, because of bitterly cold and very long winters, whereas in Spain you actually can do with much less energy. And it's not the current people in Spain and Norway who made the decision to live there, right? It's decisions that their distant ancestors made, and essentially you're punishing people for decisions they had no say in. So it may seem fair at first glance, but it does not mean that it is fair if you think about it later. If you do this on the scale of California, it's probably feasible. If you do this worldwide, it's a political non-starter, if only because of the large amounts of money that would change hands. Now most of you have seen the Coase theorem. Essentially what the Coase theorem says, and the graphical illustration or proof is in the book and in the slides and on the video, so you can look at that for yourself. You've seen it already. Essentially the Coase theorem says that it does not matter for the final price or the final allocation of permits who gets the initial permits, right? And this would be a good time to pause, right? So one of the things I said before the break is that tradable or that direct regulation is probably expensive, whereas market-based instruments are probably cheap, right? And that follows from what I'm going to do now, and this goes back to Bilbo Mall in the early 70s. So suppose there is a regulator, right, and that regulator wants to meet a particular target, particular environmental target, at the lowest possible cost. So this is a cost effectiveness analysis, right? We have a target and we want to meet the target at the lowest possible cost. So let's assume, just for sanity's sake, that the costs of emission reduction, where m is the amount of emissions reduced, is a quadratic function of that emission reduction effort m, right? So that is what you see in the top line. So the central planner then aims to minimize the total cost by adding up the cost of all the polluters. That's where the summation sign is. So the total emission reduction, the sum overall m sub n's, is greater than or equal to our societal target m, right? So how do you solve this? You form the Lagrangian, that is the L you see there, and then you take the first partial derivative of that Lagrangian, set it equal to 0, and that is where the quadratic cost function comes in. Essentially what you then have is that beta plus 2 gamma m minus lambda, that's the shadow price of the constraint, must equal 0, or the marginal costs of emission reduction, C sub m, for every polluter n must equal lambda. And the crucial insight here is that because it's a shared constraint across society, across all polluters, is that the lambda does not have a subscript. The lambda is the same for everybody. So the lowest cost, the cheapest way of meeting this particular joint target is to have the marginal cost of emission reduction equal for all polluters, right? So it's a basic arbitrage or equimarginal principle, right? So this is the situation that we want to be in. And you immediately realize that direct regulation here is hopeless, right? Because how, as a regulator, would you know the marginal cost functions of everybody who pollutes? Now, introduce a tax. So what happens if you introduce a tax to the cost function? Essentially, for every unit of pollution you avoid, for every m, you pay less tax, right? Because m is emission reduction effort, not emissions. And that means that your costs are going down. So you subtract minus t m from your costs. Now you maximize or you minimize your costs of emission reduction, or you minimize your costs. As a polluter, what do? There's an unconstrained optimization, so you just have that your marginal cost must equal 0, right? So dCdm must equal 0. dCdm is beta plus 2 gamma mn minus t. And automatically, because everybody pays the same tax, T, the T doesn't have a subscript, you automatically get to a cost-effective solution, right? As long as the tax is uniform.
Can you remind us what beta and gamma stand for? Are they the...
They're just parameters in the cost function. They just numbers, don't mean anything. What happens if you get a subsidy? Then for every M, for every unit of emissions you avoid, you get money. And as long as the subsidy is uniform, the first order conditions don't change, right? Now what happens is, so that is the bottom row. If we introduce tradable permits, then if you are a net buyer of permits, then for every unit of emissions you reduce in-house, you have to buy fewer permits, so that subtracts from your costs, right? So it's minus PM. But if you are a net seller, then for every unit of emissions you reduce extra, you can sell those things, and then your M is negative, or no, your P is negative, sorry, because you get money rather than you pay money, and you subtract a PM from your costs. Right, where P is the purchase price if you buy, and then minus P is the price you sell at, right? And in both cases, you reduce your costs. And as long as the price, the permit price, is the same for everybody, which you have in a well-functioning market, you automatically get to the equalization of marginal costs across all polluters, right? And all of this happens without the regulator knowing what are the betas and what are the gammas, right? Is that clear? We introduce these principles, or these market-based instruments, we automatically get to the cost-effective solution. Now, this is relatively straightforward math, and this was one of the first things that was sorted out in environmental economics by this man who shamefully did not get a Nobel Prize for that, Bill Beaumont. Now, what I also established is that in the short run, at the margin, taxes, subsidies, tradable permits are all the same, right? They have the same effect on the polluter and therefore on emissions. The environmental effectiveness is also the same, right? So these instruments get you to the same marginal costs if the subsidy is the negative of the tax, and the price of permits is the same as the tax that you would impose. But there are differences here. The environmental effect of taxes and subsidies is uncertain, right? If you impose a tax, what you can predict is that emissions will fall, but unless you know the cost functions of everybody in your economy, which you don't, you cannot predict with certainty the outcome of your action. But you do know for certain what the marginal cost will be, because that is the tax you just imposed. With tradable permits, provided that they're perfectly enforced, you do know the environmental outcome, but you don't know what the price will be of those permits. So you don't know the economic cost of this tradable permit scheme, unless you happen to know the cost functions of everybody in your economy, which you don't. So the question is, which of the two is worse, right? So with the system of taxation, you buy cost certainty or marginal cost certainty, but you have environmental uncertainty. Whereas with tradable permits, you buy environmental certainty, but you have cost uncertainty, right? Now, Marty Weitzman figured out a way of sorting out which one is better under which circumstances. So, let's start with a simple cost-benefit analysis, and we have a marginal damage curve in green. That is how much we care about the problem at the margin, and we have a marginal cost curve. That is how much does it cost to reduce emissions. And if you do the cost-benefit analysis, then what we have is that we want to set marginal cost equal to marginal benefits, and either we want to impose a tax P star, because that is the social optimum, or we want to impose a quantity limit Q star, because that is the social optimum, right? And the two are essentially equivalent by Samuelson, right? Now let's assume that the government or the regulator thinks that it's actually more expensive to reduce emissions than it really is. That is, they've fallen foul to a lobby of polluters who convince them that emission reduction is much more expensive than their independent advisors tell them. And the government thinks that the marginal cost of emission reduction are not the brown line, but they are the red line. So what would the government do in this case? It would set a quantity of emissions that is Q prime, that is, it would allow too many emissions, that is, there's under-regulation from an environmental perspective. Right? Because that is where the government thinks marginal costs meet marginal benefits. But if the government were to use a tax, then my lobbying story doesn't work, because the government would set a tax that is too high. And really, they have been lobbied by the Greens and not by the polluters. Right? Now, the question is, which of the two is worse? So, as soon as the cost curve is in the wrong place, we immediately highlight the asymmetry between prices and tax instruments, right? Because in one case it would be over-regulation, in the other case it would be under-regulation. Question, which of the two is worse? Well, if we look at the welfare loss of under-regulation through a quantity instrument, what happens is, well, you set a regulation here rather than here. That leads to a welfare saving for the polluters, right? That is this amount. That's the reduction in emission reduction costs total. But it leads to additional environmental damage. That's the area under the green curve, and that is larger. And the difference between the two, the social loss, is the blue triangle. And if we look at the welfare loss of over-regulation, then there's additional costs imposed on the polluters, right? The area under the brown curve, but there is, of course, less environmental damage, the area under the green curve, and the difference is the pink triangle. Now, from where you're sitting, the pink triangle is the exact same size as the blue triangle, right? So from a societal perspective, this is a matter of redistribution, but there's no welfare gain or welfare loss if you compare one to the other, right? Now, the two triangles are the exact same size. That's not an optical illusion. And that is because the green curve and the brown curve have the same slope in absolute terms. What happens if we make the green curve steeper? The blue triangle shrinks and the pink triangle grows. And if we make the green curve shallower, the blue triangle grows and the pink triangle shrinks. Right? And that is the Weitzman theorem. And Weizmann, of course, did not do it in graphically. You can read the paper if you're brave. And it's much more general than what I suggest. And if the two curves are the same size, then we are indifferent between making mistakes with quantity instruments and making mistakes with price instruments. And essentially this is the Weizmann theorem in words. If the marginal abatement cost curve is less steep than the marginal abatement, if the marginal damage cost curve is less steep than the marginal abatement cost curve, then mistakes with price instruments, that is taxes, are less costly than our mistakes with quantity instruments, that is tradable permits, and vice versa. If the marginal damage cost curve is steeper than the marginal abatement cost curve, then mistakes with quantity instruments are less costly than our mistakes with price instruments. So this is one of those it depends type of economist answers, right? But for a problem like climatic change, we actually know the relative steepness of these curves. So we have a more precise answer. Because if you talk about a problem like climate change, what matters is the total emissions of all countries in the world accumulated over decades. So if you are in charge of a small country for 4 years between 2 elections, then you cannot do a whole lot, right? You can change your emissions by a little bit, but it's not going to greatly affect climate, and therefore it's not going to greatly affect climate change, and therefore it's not going to greatly affect the damage done by climate change. So your marginal damage cost curve is shallow. It's almost flat, right? It doesn't matter whether the Netherlands reduces its emissions by 1% over the next decade or by 90% over the next decade. The climate doesn't really care what we do in the Netherlands, right? But your marginal abatement cost curve is not indifferent between whether you reduce emissions by 10% or by 90%. So your damage cost curve is shallow, your abatement cost curve is not shallow. So for a problem like climatic change, that is a stock variable and a global externality, you want to use taxation, because mistakes with taxes are much less costly than our mistakes with quantities, right? Go ahead.
Aren't quantities way more predictable? Like, you know, if you set a limit, then if you impose it, the limit will be not crossed. But with taxes, you'll never be sure what
Yes.
the company will do.
So the good thing about tradable permits is that you know the emissions.
Yeah.
But the Weizmann theorem says that you don't care much about emissions. The bad thing about setting a hard target is that you don't know your costs. But you do care about your costs, right? And with taxes, it's the other way around. You know your costs, but not your quantities. With tradable permits, you know your quantities, but not your price. And the question, which of the two do you care about most? Now, I announced this yesterday. I built a shiny app, which is something that works in R and then interactively on the web. Don't ask me how it works, it's magic. And you can play with the Weizmann theorem yourself. The graphs that I just showed are animated there, and you can drag them around if you're so inclined and you want to do this for yourself. Okay, and those two variants on it as well. And the guy you see there is, of course, Marty Weizmann, who sadly is no longer with us. No time for that story. The economic guidance is clear, right? We should use taxes rather than tradable permits. Weizmann wrote this paper in '74. It's not been disputed. So what did our dear leaders do? They went for tradable permits, right? And from the Kyoto Protocol onwards in 1997, there's free markets that were introduced. There can be emissions trade within the OECD. There can be emissions trade between countries of the OECD and countries in transition, that's the former Soviet bloc, and there can be trade between OECD countries and poorer countries for the clean development mechanism. That's free markets already. Within the EU, there's the EU emissions trading scheme, as it used to be called. It's now a system, and then a slightly separate one for aviation. That makes 5. There's a market in the northeast of the US, and one between California and Quebec. Don't ask me. That makes 7, right? Australia may or may not have a tradable emission, may or may not have tradable emissions in the near future, depending on who is prime minister at the moment. South Korea is about to introduce one. China used to have 7 tradable permit markets that are now being merged to a national one. So that makes 10 markets already, right? Now, if you think back on the condition for cost effectiveness, is that everybody pays the same price. So if you create 10 markets, then you have 10 different prices, right? So you immediately violate the condition for cost effectiveness. It is as if decision makers have listened a bit too closely to economists, right? Economists always say more is better, and economists say markets are good, and they somehow created in their mind that more markets is better, right? Which is not the case. We want a uniform and a single market. So that is going on. These markets can be coupled, yes. But let's just look at what is going on in 2 of the markets that are closest to our hearts, or at least closest to us geographically. So let's have a look at what happened in the EU emissions trading system, as it's called now, not scheme. About 60% of CO2 is covered by it now, including a little bit of methane and a little bit of nitrous, but it's mostly CO2. And it's so-called midstream trade. What is that? Well, the question is, who should hold the permits? And you can do that at 3 different ways. You can do it upstream, you can do it downstream, and you can do it midstream. What is upstream? Essentially, you can ask that everybody who digs out oil or coal from the ground, or more relevantly in the European context, imports fossil fuels into the European Union, would have a permit to do so for the eventual CO2 emission. That is upstream. The problem with an upstream trading system is market power. There's only a few companies that do this. So that is not a smart idea. You can also do it downstream. That is, the households that eventually use the electricity, that eventually burn the petrol. The problem with that is administrative costs and complexity. And for you guys, it's probably relatively simple. What you would get probably is that the bank, that you would have to have a carbon account, right? But presumably the bank would step in and say, we're going to couple your bank account with your carbon account, and every time you buy petrol, or every time you buy electricity, you automatically buy the permits necessary. And you would not really notice what is going on. It's just another line on your screen if you're looking at what is going on in your bank, right? Or maybe the utilities would offer this service. But there's still in Europe around 15% of people who don't have bank accounts, particularly the very poor and the very old. And in order to include them, the administrative cost would be overwhelming, and therefore they decided against going downstream. And then you're left with up midstream, right? Not the ones who dig the oil out of the ground, who were imported, not the ones who eventually burn it, but the big burners of energy. So those are the chemical plants, the refineries, power generators, that sort of companies are included in the EU ETS, and if they want to burn fossil fuels, they need to have a permit for the amount of CO2 that they generate. The initial allocation of permits was through grandparenting. That is, it was given away for free on the basis of emissions 2 years prior to the permit taking hold. And this was essentially a capital subsidy worth billions of euros. That now gradually being phased out, and that should be completed by 2020. One of the things that we learned during Brexit, because the UK is not just leaving the EU but also the EU ETS, is that those capital subsidies are still very valuable. So the transition to auctioning went very rapidly in non-exposed sectors, that is sectors that are not exposed to international competition, and much more slowly in sectors that are exposed to international competition. And because the UK stupidly decided to leave the EU ETS, I should have said that, there's also countries that are not in the EU, like Norway and Iceland are also part of the EU ETS. You don't need to be an EU member to be in the EU ETS, but the UK decided no, we're also going to leave the EU ETS, right, together with leaving the EU. Because of that announcement that still has not come through, the British industry no longer gets those free permits. And British Steel had counted on £100 million worth of free capital, essentially free permits, did not get it and went bankrupt, right, earlier this year. So these capital subsidies are important to companies, right, because the amounts of money are substantial. But as of next year or maybe the year after, that subsidy is finally turned to zero. The permits are, or in the ETS there's banking but not borrowing. What does that mean? That means that if you get a permit in the year 2019 to emit CO2, you can emit that CO2 in 2019 or after. So the permit has a timestamp, don't use this before 2019, but it doesn't have a timestamp, don't use this after 2019. So that is banking. You can postpone the burning, the use of your permit, but you cannot borrow. You cannot say, I'm going to promise to buy permits in the year 2030, or I'm going to use my 2030 permits in the year 2019. That does not work, and that of course has to do with the difficulty of intertemporal enforcement, right? You made that promise, but then you go bankrupt in the meantime, and what then happens, right? You do need a certain amount of flexibility, and that is why the permits that you actually get do not say 2019, but the permits that you say 2008, 2012, or 2013 to 2020. Now, why is that? Because you impose a hard cap on your emissions. And there is natural variability in the economy with recessions and so on and so forth. There's also natural variability in the amount of energy that you use. So if you are in a boom year and the economy is growing fast and you're burning a lot of energy, and then you enter into a very cold autumn, so you're burning a lot of energy, and then you're running out of permits on the 23rd of December, what are you going to do? Are you going to sort of put Rutte with his head on the telly and say, sorry guys, Christmas is cancelled and we're going to reopen the country on the 1st of January and we're not going to burn any more energy for the last 7 days of the year? 8 days. No, you can't be in that situation that at the end of your accounting period you run out of permits, right? Because that would kill. So therefore, in order to sort of minimize the effect of that natural variability in energy use and emissions, you sort of average over a longer period rather than over a shorter accounting period, right? And then that natural variability washes out. And then to make sure that things don't go wrong, you allow a safety valve. That is, if you emit more than you are permitted to, you pay a fine, right? That fine in Europe is steep. It's 1,000 euros per ton of CO2. The price of permits is 25 at the moment. So there is an escape valve, right? But you pay 40 times over the odds. So you would be bloody stupid to do it. So what you're looking at here is the evolution of the EU ETS price since its inception in 2005 all the way up to a year ago, and I should have updated this. The current price is actually 25. It's not that there's been a flat line of the last year, but the price just happened yesterday. Yesterday's price just happened to return to the price of last year around this time. And what you see is a fair amount of variability. It started with a low price, then it rose pretty quickly, then it collapsed, then it recovered, then it started sliding down again, and now it's going up again, right? The initial high price is explained by the behavior of two German utilities. As I said, permits were initially grandfathered. Nobody knew what this was worth. The market was very thin, and these two companies essentially sold a chunk of permits to each other. So company A sold to company B on Monday, and then on Tuesday company B sold to company A, and they went back and forth, and they did so, and they sold at very high prices that sort of scared everybody away from the market. And they did this as a collusion, and they did this to convince Merkel that emission reduction is really, really expensive and she should not tighten emission standards. That's why they did this. This is illegal collusion, collusionary behavior. Then the price, so the market sort of developed. The price collapsed when the market discovered that there was an over-allocation of permits. It went essentially to zero. Come back to why there was an over-allocation in a second. Then the price recovered, and it turned out that the EU's projections of economic growth were not nearly close to the realization of economic growth, right? The EU sort of started the allocation of permits assuming that the Lisbon targets would be met. That is, we would all become incredibly rich in a very short time. Did not happen. So the economic projections that were the basis for the emission projections turned out to be all wrong, and Europe entered into a period of economic stagnation. And that means that there was again over-allocation of permits, and that drove the price down. And then they reformed the market essentially by taking a whole lot of permits out, and that is driving up the price in at the very end. So why was there initial over-allocation of permits? As I said, this was done by grandparenting, and initially the grandparenting was done by member states. I also told you that initially around half of all emissions were covered by the EU ETS. And the other half was sort of unregulated. So what do you do as a government? You take some of that unregulated half and you slip it into your regulated half, and you give additional permits to your companies. And if your companies in your country have excess permits, they can sell them at a profit to other companies in other EU member states. Right? A brilliant plan, were it not for the fact that everybody did this, right? So there was this over supply. And they changed this by taking away the initial allocation from the member states and shifted it to the European Commission. Free after Lenin, right? Whenever property is theft, whenever you create property rights, somebody's going to try and steal it. Now, these permits are not permits on paper. That's just as an electronic registry, and lo and behold, those registries were hacked and people made off with a whole lot of permits. So other things that went wrong. Initially, the treatment of VAT on permits was different between different EU member states. Now, VAT is not collected by the taxman. VAT is collected by companies on behalf of the taxman, who are then supposed to hand it over. So what do? You buy permits in a country where there's no VAT. You sell those permits in a country where there is VAT. You collect the VAT on behalf of the taxman. You buy more permits, you sell more permits, buy more permits, then you have a whole load of unpaid VAT, and before the taxman comes knocking on your door, you run off to the Caribbean, right? It's essentially a money-making machine. It's illegal. Don't do this. You can't do it anymore because they realized belatedly that, yes, this is a open door to tax fraud, right? Don't quite know how much money was stolen. All of these things were predicted, by the way, and all of these things were ignored by the European Commission.
Can actually anybody buy permit? Like, can I just go and buy it on myself now and put it home?
Well, as I said, they're electronic, right? So it's not that you get a certificate that you can put on your wall.
Yeah, of course.
Um,
When you use it for speculation, let's say, if I'm not actually I'm not a company or any individual.
you need to register, but registration is very, very simple. It's not that you have to meet a lot of criteria. So yes, you can. Go ahead.
But is there also like a finite amount of permits right now, so you can sort of like buy out the permits to make?
Yes, you can. And organizations, I think it's Friends of the Earth, have tried to raise money to do exactly this and have failed to raise substantial sums of money. So it is feasible and it's permissible, but it's not done, really.
And is there also sort of black market for like companies to?
But I gave you one example
and
of
resell permits because there are so many markets.
I won't have time to go into this. So there is fungibility between certain markets. So if you buy a permit on the CDM market, called the CER, then you can use that to offset your EU ETS permits. So there is a certain fungibility between markets, but not all markets. And that is actually a point I was coming to. So, to complete these issues, right? So, emissions are actually not monitored. We cannot see CO2 emissions. We do not measure CO2 emissions. Instead, we impute CO2 emissions from energy use. And we monitor energy use, right? And then CO2 is derived from that. And that requires a certain number of administrative tasks. The civil servant who was responsible for this in Romania got pregnant, went on maternity leave, and was not replaced for a year or so. So for a year, nobody in Romania checked emissions. Romania was kicked out of the United Nations scheme for this, but not out of the European scheme. And similar things happened for different reasons in Lithuania and Slovakia, where monitoring was faulty. If you look at the emissions trade, there's a whole lot of Romanian companies who are incredibly active in this market. For reasons that are entirely mysterious. Romania sells and buys about 100 times its annual emissions on the open market. That leads me to my final point, and my final point for today, and the rest you will have to read from the book, and what's the videos of previous years, and going back to your point, right? So, at the moment, monitoring is done by the member states, or if you look at a country like the UK, actually not by the UK government, but by the government of Wales and Scotland and Northern Ireland, right? It's a devolved competence. Enforcement is also in the hands of the member states. Now, there's two forms of liability. There's buyer beware and there's seller beware. And buyer beware is if you buy oranges in the supermarket. So if you go into the supermarket, you buy a net of mandarins or oranges, and you pay for them, and you walk out of the supermarket, and you discover that half of them are rotten, then that is your problem, right? Because you should have looked at them before you paid. That is buyer beware liability. Seller beware is if you buy a second-hand car, you pay for it, you take it to another garage, and you let them check it, and they discover structural problems that the seller did not tell you about, then within 4 weeks you can bring your car back and get your money back. Or if you have a house built, and within 7 years after the house was delivered to you, you discovered that there's fundamental problems in the foundation, structural problems in the foundation of that house, you can go back to the people who built it and get your money back, right? That is seller beware. And the reasons for this is asymmetric information, right? Just go back to Akerlof and Stiglitz. That is why we do this. Now, permits are buyer beware. That is, if a company in the Netherlands buys permits from a company in Italy, and it turns out that the company in Italy did not reduce its emissions, even though it sold all its permits, then the Dutch company needs to call up the Dutch regulator and say, I accidentally bought fraudulent permits, and then the Dutch regulator will say, thank you for your honesty, you're off the hook. And then the Dutch regulator needs to call up the Italian regulator and say one of your companies has been naughty, and the Italian regulator will say thank you very much, hang up the phone and go back to sleep. Right? Now, why do I'm not picking on Italy, but Italy for a long time had a convicted fraudster as its prime minister, right? Italy falsified its accounts for milk production to get European subsidies, and it falsifies its accounts for olive oil production to get European subsidies. The Greek government falsifies its GDP records to get into the euro. Organized crime is part of the government in Cyprus. Organized crime is part of the government in Romania. These are the people who enforce emission regulations, right? And now that the price of emissions is going up again, it becomes more and more lucrative to indeed defraud the system. Now, going back to your question, the Americans in the Northeast have their own tradable permit system called REGI, and it makes perfect sense to couple the two systems and have transatlantic trade in permits. That is a mutually advantageous trade to both. Now, they came, they looked, and they walked away. And why? Because they did not trust the Europeans to enforce their environmental regulations to the same standards that Americans are used to. And that is why there is no transatlantic trade in permits. And that goes back to this enforcement issue. So now what did I not do? I did not talk about the CDM. You need to read about that yourself. I did not talk about technological progress and instruments that you would need to do that before that. So you need to read on that yourself and watch the video.